let me give you two ways of looking at conflict of interest. All right? The first way is, what is the legal definition of conflict of interest? And the legal definition is very simple, and it's the same in most countries. All right? The legal definition of conflict of interest is anything that might have an impact on your ability to make an independent judgment. And under various laws, it then goes on and says things like, if you stand to gain materially, personally. All right? And often many of the legislative frameworks say if that is to occur, then you must abstain from voting and in some cases leave the room. That's what some of the legislative frameworks say. But what most people don't realise is that the same legislative frameworks say the next thing, comma, or is otherwise decided by the board. So the true definition of conflict of interest is very simple. It's whatever the board decides is a conflict of interest is a conflict of interest. It's very simple. Whatever the board decides is a conflict of interest is a conflict of interest. And if the board decides it is not a conflict of interest, then it's not. And you can do three things with a conflict of interest. Logically, what would they be? What are the three things that you can do with a board member where someone has declared a conflict of interest, either the board member or someone else there, a potential conflict of interest? What are the three things logically that you can do with that director? So the first thing is you can abstain from voting and leave the room, or leave the room and abstain from voting is one thing. Second logical thing is you can abstain from voting but participate in the discussion. The third thing you can do is say, oh well, it's not a conflict of interest as a board, but it's the board's decision on how to deal with conflict of interest. Right? And there's nothing right nor wrong about it, it just is. And we made the comment before, is that if you never have any conflict of interest, if you never have any interest from the board members around the board table, you've got the wrong board directors there.
One thing, though, that you do have to be careful of is perception in the community. You know, so when you're defining it, you've got to say, would I be willing to wake up and see this plastered on the front page of the newspaper tomorrow?
And that's the discussion the board needs to have. Because in the end, it's not whether or not there's a true conflict, it's all about perception. Is there a conflict of interest there? Well, we think there might not be, but if it was to be plastered out there, there would be. So please, what we're asking you to do is participate in the discussion, but do not vote. Or, in fact, if it's such a strong potential conflict by segments of our community, if they ever found out that you were involved, so please leave the room while we discuss it. But in the end, it's the board's decision, not the individual's decision. The individual can still choose to leave the room and not participate, but if the individual director says, no, there is no conflict of interest, and the board says, yes, there is, guess what? There is. And if the board says, leave the room, even if they're an executive director as well, even if they're a staff person, then they have to leave the room for that part of the discussion. So a register of interest is very useful, very simple to do, and please, if you don't have one, ensure that you do.